For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Deborah Byers here with something we're super excited about. We've got Roger Pielke joining us today. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a professor emeritus at Colorado. He's an esteemed author and scholar on climate science, and he's someone who's been doing it for a long time, and he's a dear friend. Roger, also, this is his fourth appearance on COBT. And as I think back on those conversations, and the world has changed dramatically. One of the things that we've been asking here, Roger, is what is the state of the decarbonization debate? What's the state of the climate community, so to speak? And there's been some recent developments there. Roger will tell us about them that are very timely, very important, and underreported. Is, I think, what I would say, given the significance of them. So, Roger, I need to stop talking and let you talk, but thank you so much for joining us. You're too kind to come back and join us for a fourth appearance.
Oh, it's great to join you again. And boy, you hit the nail on the head. Things have changed in a lot of ways in climate science and policy since the last time we chatted.
Well, before we jump in, and Roger, you were last with us in the fall of 25. Mike, I happened to go back and listen to a little bit of that. Wow, that was so different. It was pre-Iran, and it was the kind of the sixth inning of this drumbeat around we have too much oil, we're oversupplied, oil is in the 60s, maybe it'll go much lower. It's just, and that was not that long ago. So it's amazing how quickly the world changes. But Mike, why don't I turn to you for the market update?
Yeah, Maynard, we just wanted to start off by saying what we've been saying for many weeks, especially as the Iran war enters its 10th week. Can you believe that? 10 weeks. And that's that markets continue to trade up and down on the Iran war and really nothing else. Now, on the bond market front, we wanted to highlight that 10-year bond yields are trading up to roughly 4.45% today after a hot CPI print of roughly 3.8%. Now, bottom line, U.S. bond yields continue to inch higher as a growing concern for what's the Iran war means for short and longer term inflation and the potential for interest rate increases rather than decreases, which a lot of people were expecting several months ago, but less so today. Now, on the broader equity market front, we wanted to highlight that the S&P 500 is pulling back marginally today on the hot CPI print. However, it's still trading near all-time highs, and we believe it's dialing in optimism for an end to the Iran war, which is counter to all other markets right now. Bottom line, the S&P 500 is up roughly 1.5% over the last week, with technology really outperforming, up around 6%, and seemingly it's retaking back market leadership. Now, on the oil market front, WTI today is trading at roughly $102 per barrel, which is kind of sideways from last Tuesday's close. Now, to us, WTI seems to have temporarily settled in an $85 to $105 per barrel range. I know that sounds really large, and it is pretty large. But the lower end is, when we trade down to the lower end, it's occurring when traders kind of think that there's going to be an end to the Iran war. And obviously, it's trading to the higher end when it seems to be decreasing, when the war seems to be decreasing, which is where we are today. I think most people think this war has become much more complicated than it did, just a week ago, even, 7 or 8 weeks ago. So it's something to keep an eye on. Now, something we want to highlight this week, especially for those who think that oil prices are going to come crashing down once the Strait of Hormuz is open, came from Saudi Aramco's CEO. He indicated this week that roughly 1 billion barrels have already been pulled out of global oil storage. And here's the kicker. He also thinks another 500 million barrels could be pulled from oil storage, even if the war ends soon, which means that oil prices are probably going to stay elevated into 2027. Now, on the energy sector front, we'd highlight that first quarter energy earnings calls are mostly complete, with last week's call mostly dominated by E&P companies. We'd also know that Diamondback Energy, from their they basically moved from their long-held, sort of yellow light oil macro scenario to a green oil macro scenario, and they also increased their 2026 capex and activity levels, which was mostly expected. Now, the one thing we say is, on the other hand, most E&Ps that reported did not follow suit, and we repeat that they did not follow suit, and they held firm with their previous 2026 capital spending plans. Bottom line, we also expect 2026 E&P capex spending will be boosted on second quarter calls. We thought there would be a little bit more companies beyond Diamondback Energy that would basically increase CapEx. It didn't happen in first quarter. We think it's going to happen on second quarter calls. And it's due to our belief that oil prices will remain higher and for longer. And the biggest beneficiary of this is not going to be the E&P companies. It's going to be basically North American oil service companies. So keep an eye out for that. Now, the last thing we'd highlight is a geothermal company, and that's Fervo Energy. They're IPOing this week, and it'll be fun and interesting to see how it performs on day one and beyond. So we're kind of keeping a close eye on it to see investor optimism in geothermal. So with that, Maynard, we're really looking forward to talking to Roger today and also having Deborah join us today. So with that, we'll hand it back to you.
Okay, Mike, thanks. And again, happy anniversary to you and Kim. I hope I don't get in trouble with Kim for borrowing you for the market update. Okay, shh, be quiet. Deborah, before we jump in with Roger, anything that is on your mind besides, I know so much is on your mind, that's a ridiculous question, but what would you tell us as we gear up to talk climate science today?
Well, one thing I would say is, I've been following Roger since he first started writing about this when he was still in Colorado, but I think this is such an important conversation, and you said it. Things so much has changed, but I would question: has the actual underlying facts changed, or is it just that now we're starting to see what was the reality versus what was really a narrative that was being pushed around? Where consumption is going, where fossil fuels needs are going. So this will be a good discussion.
Well, Deborah, you've had a long career, both at EY and then on boards where, there's always a model, right? There's always a model, the model. And then there are cases, and then, the upside, the downside. We're all used to that kind of culture. And Roger, as we turn to you, there's been a change in the models. But if you don't mind, we'll attach a link here to your recent Substack that focuses everybody on this. But let me turn it over to you and have you explain a pretty dramatic development that's taken place.
Yeah, I mean, let me just set the larger context. In the last year, even less, the discussion of climate energy has been turned on its head. It's for a long time in a lot of policy discussions. Energy policy was viewed as a subset of climate policy, and whether it was Larry Fink or Bill Gates or Mark Carney, things started changing recently, where people recognize, well, energy is not just about the climate. Climate's important. Climate change is real. And we see this with this discussion of affordability and, the war in Iran, after the war in Ukraine has really focused people's attention on energy supply and security. Now, in April of this year, something even bigger happened. The committee that is responsible for providing the scenarios that inform all of climate modeling, that project the future of the climate system, they released their newest iteration of scenarios. And just without going too much into the details, the scenarios outline how many people are going to be on the planet, how big our economy is going to be, where we get our energy from, how we produce it. They're not predictions, and they span a wide range. You need those to be able to inform climate models of how much emissions we're going to have, how much pollution, and so on. Well, it turns out that they have retired the most extreme scenario that has dominated climate research for the last 15 years or so. This is huge news. It's also going to be very disruptive because there are estimates of many tens of thousands of scientific articles have been published using the most extreme scenario. People will say, well, we never thought it was the most likely, but it's certainly the most commonly used scenario. It's informed everything from government policy to regulation to central bank stress testing to design criteria for coastal infrastructure and so on. And so the new high scenario is much lower than the previous one. And that's going to reverberate all through climate science, impact assessments, and into policy.
Can I ask you, Roger, so this is the RCP 8.5 scenario you're referring to. Could you just take us through some of those key assumptions in that model, just to give people a feel for, why it was retired, right? Why this no longer, and then we'll get into maybe why it wasn't retired sooner, but that would be great.
Right. The yeoman work has been done by my colleague Justin Ritchie almost a decade ago now from the University of British Columbia, and the central weakness, I guess, in the scenarios, and it's not just the extreme scenarios, it's across the scenarios, is an assumption that the world was going to develop coal infrastructure, coal energy, to the exclusion of pretty much everything else for the rest of this century. Coal, as most people know, is the most carbon-intensive fossil fuel, twice as much carbon dioxide emission per unit of energy as compared to natural gas. These scenarios built in a future where by 2100, so the RCP 8.5 requires the equivalent of something like 30 or 40,000 new coal-fired power plants to be built around the world. Obviously, that would lead to a huge amount of carbon dioxide emissions and large amounts of climate change. For people who are familiar with the temperature targets in 2100, something like 5 degrees Celsius by 2100. The Paris Agreement is below 2 degrees Celsius. So it was a very extreme, catastrophic scenario. It's in recent years, it's been recognized, no, the world actually is not going all in on coal everywhere all the time. We're not going to be building 30 to 40,000 new coal-fired power plants this century. And so the dissonance between where the world was actually headed and what the scenarios said has been around for a little while. But the big news is that the community now has recognized that and has retired these very extreme scenarios.
And Roger, help me, because I don't want to overstate this, because for those of us in energy, all we do is energy. The coal phase out began arguably in the 90s in the US. Anyway, so a scenario like the one you just described is impossible to understand from an energy standpoint how that could ever play out. But then help me with this, because I don't want to overestimate this, but this scenario, it was the worst scenario. It had this assumption on we're basically going to all coal. And then this scenario would be, it was of course yielding the worst results. And then this scenario was the one that so many people would look at and say, see, we have to do something. I don't want to overstate it, but this is a pretty incredible, it's incredible it existed, and incredible it existed for so long. And that was the takeaway that we were using from this. Am I overstating that?
No, not exactly. I mean, there are some nuances there, and there were multiple levels of mistakes made. So one is the theory that underlie the scenario, and it's not just one scenario; it underlies the entire family, the entire project of scenarios. Was this return to coal, documented by Justin Ritchie and Hadi Dalatabadi, and that the scenarios assume that because we used a lot of coal, we were just going to get better and better at doing it. It was going to get cheaper and cheaper, and it was going to replace everything. That was a mistake. And we make mistakes with theories and so on. But another big mistake was that this one extreme scenario was the one that the science community decided this is where we're headed. This is what's called a reference scenario. This is what the world will look like unless we have aggressive climate policy. And anyone who works with scenarios, and the folks in the energy industry, going all the way back to the Shell scenarios, are familiar. Scenarios aren't predictions. They're plausible futures that outline the consequences of different paths we might take. But for the last 15 years or so, the climate community focused on one scenario, the most extreme scenario, as where we were headed. And so, as you say, that created a distorted view of the climate future. It had a very extreme projection, but at the same time, it also made mitigation or reducing carbon dioxide emissions look a lot more expensive because we had so much more to do. So it had a number of different errors in it, and one difference between the climate science community and the energy world is that people in the energy community update their scenarios every year. So if you look at the IEA, EIA, you look at the energy majors, BP, DNV, other folks, they come out with a new projection every year. The climate science community, for some good reasons, but also some reasons that aren't so good, only updates their scenarios on a decade or longer time frame, which means that they will get out of date. And that's what we saw happen here.
Hey, Roger, on the update piece, I mean, I think there's two things you said that are pretty important. A lot of people don't really understand or have internalized. One, these are scenarios. They're not predictions. And a lot of times by the time it gets out to sort of public consumption, the climate models are viewed as predictions of the future versus scenarios used to analyze potential outcomes. And so you can kind of weigh risks. I mean, there's no problem with having an extreme scenario per se. The problem is saying that is a reference scenario, and now you're going to actually, allocate capital to it. You're going to make, and you're going to enforce decisions on policy. But so that was one. I think that's really critical. Scenarios are not predictions. And then the other question I just have always had about these models is, as you say, we update models all the time, very complex models in any business, not just energy. But why? I mean, I understand in the scientific community that you don't want to be updating it, annually, right? These are long dated analyses. There's no reason to, per se. But why didn't they update that when, especially during the shale boom, when you saw all the natural gas come on and you saw the trend lines? It was clearly visible in the United States what was happening with the coal retirements and the replacement with both renewables and natural gas. So why was there not an update? I think that's a key question we ought to answer.
Yeah, some of this gets to the fact that, and that, there's nothing nefarious here. Justin Ritchie and I in our paper called it an emergent phenomena. There's a multiple reasons. One is that climate modeling, so Earth system modeling, takes a long time. It's computationally intensive. It takes years to do. And so if we were updating scenarios every year, we'd have to come up with a new way to approach modeling the climate future. So the science community likes to have scenarios fixed. Another reason is that the RCP8.5 with the extreme scenarios produced research that scientific journals liked. It got a lot of clicks. University press offices liked because they could put out press releases. Climate change will do X, Y, and Z in 2100, and look how bad that is. Obviously, the media likes that. And for individual faculty members, or scientists, you get a lot of career rewards for having press releases and media coverage and publishing in major journals. So there's a really strong incentive cycle out there. But also, if you look at policy, if you have an extreme scenario and you say, well, we need to go to a very low emission scenario, the gap between the two shows really large benefits. And so if you want to promote climate policy based on some assessment of the benefits of action, it really helps if you're starting in an extreme place. So all these factors kind of came together. And I mean, I can tell you, when we started doing our work, and it was our group, and there's others out there, really not quite a decade ago, but about, the first response to us was, well, you guys must be climate deniers if you don't believe this scenario. In 2022, the head of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and also one of the chair people of the IPCC responded to a piece and said, yeah, RCP 8.5 is where we're going. So there was a lot of resistance to the critiques. And that's one reason why I think this is so amazing. It's basically the entire scientific community has now accepted these critiques as the baseline.
One question, Roger, is maybe this becomes a little bit circular, because if you have such a draconian downside case and it gets people's attention and it spurs policy action, or it spurs just more focus on decarbonization, somebody would probably tell us that downside case, its existence contributed to the elimination of the case. It's like, I don't want to be circular and I don't want to make excuses for being inaccurate and forecasting, but I'm sure that type of argument is being made.
Yeah, Maynard, you're spot on. This argument has been made. I published my piece just in the last little bit. And since that time, there's been a little cottage industry of folks who are saying, well, of course the scenarios are out of date because we've been making such great progress on decarbonization and climate policy. This is one where we can actually evaluate decarbonization. We can look at carbon intensity, we can look at energy intensity of the economy. And the simple fact of the matter is, to date, climate policy has not resulted in an acceleration of decarbonization, which is carbon dioxide per unit of GDP. We can also project forward. The simple fact of the matter is, whatever effects climate policy in general has had, the scenarios were flawed from the outset based on their assumption of too much coal. So it's not a situation where, good for us, we're really making great progress in reducing emissions, and that's why the scenarios are out of date. That's just doesn't square with the facts.
And I was going to say, because the scenarios, when you're measuring that, it was already high, so it looks good now relative to now. But if you kind of measure it on a static basis, and I think you were at the summit a couple of years ago, and you had a really interesting chart, maybe worth kind of passing around after this podcast, but where you show that at the trend line of where the emissions are going. And
Right.
so you have a policy, you have a scenario that was trying to, with all good intent, enact a policy to lower emissions and decarbonize. It hasn't been effective. So what next?
Yeah, and you reminded me of the summit, and the folks participating got a preview of all this stuff. So none of this should be a surprise to anyone.
What I remember about that summit that was fascinating to me, Roger, is you asked for a show of hands as to how many people were familiar with RCP 8.5. So everybody in the room is connected to the global energy complex in some way, shape, or form. And I feel like 10%. Was it that many?
I don't think it was that many.
So this scenario, such a driving force, and very few people, even in energy, were versed in it. And these are people that take a full day and go to a summit. So this is the above average community of energy people.
Yeah, so this is, admittedly, this is down in the weeds, and this is the sort of stuff that it comes before we do Earth system modeling, and most people get the results of modeling and projections, and that's the starting point for a lot of people who work in economics and in industry and impacts. So I get it, but really everyone should know about RCP 8.5 and the changes, because going forward, that is going to change everything about how we talk about climate change. Now, let me just be very clear. Climate change is real. It's a serious problem. It's a risk management problem. It's one that we should deal with. We can only decarbonize as fast as we can decarbonize. But the degree to which this extreme scenario has been baked into policy, science, regulation is incredible. And so unwinding that is going to take some time and some care.
One of the things over the years that really struck us, Roger, was population estimates. And, they factor in so many models. You take the population and you multiply times per capita something, energy use or CO2 emissions or whatever, and you get your total number. Do you want to talk about that variable in these scenarios? Because there's some big swings that can happen in population by 2100.
Yeah, it's another great point, Maynard. One of the big changes, and I think it's going to be one that we're all going to be talking about before too long, is demographic projections this century for how many people are going to be on planet Earth have been plummeting around the world. And I will tell you, these new scenarios, even though they've gotten rid of the extreme cold scenarios, they've gone the other direction on population. In fact, the new high scenario in the scenario set has 14 billion people and growing on the planet in 2100. Now, for people who understand demographics, that is not going to happen. There is talk now that global population may peak soon after mid-century, 9.5, 10.5 billion, and then go down at that point. And so the next big revision to climate scenarios, and I hope it's sooner rather than later, will be to align them with the most recent global population projections. And again, that's going to result in a scaling back. It doesn't make climate change go away, and it doesn't solve the problem, but it gives us a very different perspective. The demographic shifts are far more important than just climate change. They're going to change the nature of our economies, who does work. We're going to need more robots, more automation, but it's going to be a huge story going forward in the 21st century.
Yeah, Roger, just back to this reference case, and you talked about, this is a really, really big deal. So I guess my question is, what does this really mean, like right now, today, from a policy standpoint? What does that mean from an investment capital standpoint? What does that mean from an energy mix standpoint? Maybe right now, maybe 3 years from now, how do you think about that? Or, it sounds great talking about the general case, but what are the real implications of this?
Yeah, so I think the most significant near-term implications are going to be for people who actually build infrastructure, like flood defenses, or you have to design some sort of a capital holding for a bank for stress testing. For those folks, the worst case scenario, it was never a worst case scenario because it was never actually valid, but the worst case scenario has to be rethought. And so for people who allocate capital or build things, you care about what's the maximum probable flood we might see. What's hurricane incidents look like? That makes a big difference. For people in the energy space, I don't think it actually makes a lot of difference, simply because there are multiple factors like security, affordability, energy access that really drive decisions. At the governmental level, I think it's going to be a big factor in regulations. If you look at the U.S. government in the 2018, the U.S. National Climate Assessment, so the scientific body that assesses science, had RCP 8.5 as where we were headed, and a lower scenario, RCP 4.5, as climate success. Well, guess what? The world is undershooting that 4.5 scenario now. And no one would say we're headed for climate success. So rethinking how governments think about regulation and policy will probably be next after infrastructure and capital deployment in banking and elsewhere.
And maybe one more question too is, you talked about this scenario analysis being looked at every 10 years, right? And I guess my question is, like with AI and stuff like that, do we see this like accelerating, like we're going to start to look at it every 3 or 5 years, or how does that play into things?
Great question, and it's one that needs a lot of thought and action in the scientific community. I have this vision that one day we might be able to have kind of bespoke climate projections where someone could say, all right, here's the assumptions I want to bring to the table. I'm going to plug them in, and then at the end, I'm going to get climate projections out the other end. The idea of standardizing scenarios down to 4 or 7 scenarios, and then everyone in the community uses them. If you think about it, it creates really single points of failure. One bad assumption, like about coal, and everything is messed up. So we need more diversity in how we think about the future, and we need a faster turnaround. And that's, as everyone knows, academia and the scientific community doesn't turn on a dime. That implies a really different approach to thinking through how we do climate science and climate scenarios. It's not going to be easy. And another part of the problem is, and I hear this from a lot of climate scientists, they say, we're not in the business of policy. We're not in the business of helping banks with their capital requirements. We just want to project the climate and better understand it. And that's fine and it's valid, but stone approach. Hey, let's use these models and scenarios for good climate science. And at the same time, let's apply that exact same science to the energy industry, to the banking industry, to government regulation. And that 2 birds with 1 stone approach just doesn't work.
What do you think this does, Roger, to it's funny, you can be in energy meetings right now and we have a certain regulatory environment-ish, we have a certain policies coming out of Washington, D.C. And the thing that people love to say is, well, what would President Newsom do? And there's always this thing about you might get that kind of change, right? And he's held up because it seems like he would bring the most extreme change. When this happens, what do you think that does to the decarbonization discussion, and what does it do to policy, like is one way to think about this is it's not only eliminated a climate downside, it's eliminated a policy downside or a regulatory downside as well. Is that too much?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is where we need to have an open and honest discussion of what these more moderated scenarios mean for policy. I mean, everyone is familiar with the idea of the social cost of carbon, and I can get a really high number with a more moderate scenario. You tell me what number you want, and we can produce it. And so, if you remember, the Biden administration had a very high number, something like $180 a ton. First Trump administration came in and they got a number like $7 a ton. Trump administration's done away with it. If a Newsom administration comes in, they could generate a very high one, with a different set of assumptions. And so none of that on either side of the aisle is particularly honest science. Talking about how we make energy more affordable, more secure, improve the U.S. standing and lasting impact with durable policy really doesn't depend a lot on these scenarios. My hope is, what should happen and what might happen are different things. My hope is that the more moderated scenarios force a discussion of what a more durable and robust energy policy that includes climate, but is not only climate, might look like in the United States. And so I'm hopeful that the next administration takes energy policy seriously, which hasn't been done for a while.
I think there's two things that really strike me and I've been thinking about for a while, which is you really need to separate the science and why that's important, because there's still great uncertainty about Earth systems, climate change, all of that. I mean, that's sort of a completely separate debate. And that's been subsumed by the policy desires of, different parts of our society. And you can respect people have different objectives around decarbonization. Faster, no, we have more time, we can be more measured about it, and it has other collateral effects. Energy policy can't just be about climate. Got to get out of the climate, what we call it, the carbon tunnel vision, because there's a lot more to think about. And so is there a possibility that we could kind of start to separate those two? You mentioned, hey, Mike said it, and we've got all of these tools at our disposal now from a technology and AI standpoint. There's no reason you couldn't run these scenarios in more real time, take those models. And so if you separate that, isn't that a better outcome? Then we can have sort of a policy debate. What are the trade-offs? What is it that you want as a society? What can you afford? Affordability is like our number one topic right now around energy. And then let's let loose the climate study. I mean, we talk about this as the most existential issue that we face, and yet we don't even want to, make updates. We don't want to debate the issues underpinning this, whether it's economic assumptions or whether it's even scientific assumptions about how the Earth systems really work. So maybe separating those two. So, whether it's President Newsom or, the next president, Rubio or Vance, who knows, we can have those two separate discussions.
Yeah, I mean, you hit a good. I mean, the notion of climate being an existential threat, which we've heard a lot about. Those words do not appear in the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. They don't appear really anywhere in the scientific literature, maybe on some fringes. But the idea of calling climate an existential threat is to end debate. If it's the end of the world, if it's the end of humanity, then of course we would pay any price. We would take any step. And it turns out that is not a good way to approach energy policy. It's complicated. It's nuanced. It's varied. In some places, solar and batteries make a lot of good sense. In some places, wind makes sense. Natural gas makes sense most everywhere, and nuclear will go where it makes sense. And having that discussion and saying, what do these options we have do for affordability, for security and energy supply, for reliability, but also for decarbonization. Let's have that discussion. And as you say, we have to recognize there will be trade-offs across those. And in a democracy, people are going to weigh those in different ways. But one thing that's notable about energy and climate discussions is we simply haven't had that discussion at the national level. I don't think ever.
Roger, if you pause on this, do you mind telling us again why this happened now?
This is a great question. So the peer-reviewed literature that critiques the RCP 8.5 has been around for a decade. So if you're paying attention, I gave my first talk, public talk, on RCP 8.5 in January of 2018, saying a lot of the stuff that I say now. And others, Justin Ritchie's papers came out the year before, and there's been a lot of people talking about it. In the climate policy world, a projection has developed that's called current policies. And what it says is this is where the world is headed if we keep doing what we're doing. And in terms of temperature outcomes, they're all between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase by 2100, centered on about 2.5. That's been widely accepted. At the same time, the scientific community has been putting out these studies, media's been reporting on them, government's been acting on them, that are like 5 degrees. And so you have this dissonance. You have a really high 5 degree, and then you have a real world projection around 2.5. And of course, the community updates its scenarios only so often. And that was going to happen regardless. And my sense of it is that the gap between where we're headed and what was contained in these legacy models became too great to not do something about it. And so, all credit to the people in the international community. It's just a small group of scientists who put these scenarios together. That's a whole nother story that we could talk about. But to their credit, they saw where the science is and adjusted accordingly. We could debate whether it took too long or it was too late, but they've set the world on a new path in terms of climate science.
I'm just struck by Deborah and Mike and Roger. This happened. Now, of course, there's a lot of really serious stuff in the news, a lot of big issues in the world, but this is a major development, and yet it seems kind of quiet-ish relative to its importance. And I'm just imagining, what if this had happened in 2021? I mean, this would be the above the fold in every paper in the Western world, and so it's just really striking. Do you have a comment on how people are reacting, or why it's not bigger news? Or I mean, I have my own. We all have our own theories, but it's amazing, so big yet so quiet.
Yeah, I mean, I called it, and I think it's true. I said it's the biggest development in climate science in decades. I did a review of media coverage just over the weekend, and I published it. And in the Netherlands, it's a huge issue in all the newspapers. It had huge coverage in Germany. In Australia, I was there last fall, and I gave a talk, and it got a lot of coverage. I haven't seen anything on this story. I mean, it is kind of technical. At the same time, it requires the media to do a little bit of accountability. So there's a Dutch newspaper, Die Volkskrant, and one of the journalists there said, all right, I'm going to take a look back at our own coverage of climate and see how many of our articles in the last year or some other period were based on RCP 8.5. And they published it. They said we had 54 articles based on just RCP 8.5. And so correcting course will require, I mean, imagine if you're the New York Times, they probably would come up with 500 or 1,000 articles. It's very hard to say, whoops, we went down the wrong path there for a little while. So I do think that part is going to be difficult. I do think this story is going to get out. I can tell you on my own Substack, by far, the most read post I've ever done is this one on RCP 8.5. So there are people reading it and discussing it, and there's a lot of talk on social media. So I think it's just a matter of time before this gets out and is more broadly discussed.
The one I think it was one of your colleagues, Jessica, trying to remember her last name, but she talked about how a lot of these scenarios were baked into. You mentioned infrastructure, and some the banks are looking at this, or were using that reference case. But think about insurance. So if you're modeling out a more extreme scenario on flood risk and hurricane risk, and you start to move those factors at a higher level, then that's going to show up, I would think. I don't know how all of that gets crunched, but you would think that starts to show up in the way they think about, hey, what areas are we going to even offer coverage? What are those premiums going to be, et cetera. And I think those are the kinds of, I would love to see someone dig into that from a, main media.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of discussion we should have, because not to like throw anybody under the bus or, really, there has to be some accountability for how that shows up to the average person, because it did have impact. And that's your point. This was baked into just vast swaths of analysis that the business community as well as the government regulatory community was using. And that has real like impact to the average person. That seems like a story that somebody ought to be running.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, there are, I mean, we can all agree there are many settings where climate science and climate modeling is really just window dressing, or it's qualitative. Oh, things are going to be really bad, we should do something. But there are industries and applications for which the numbers actually matter. And so if you are, as you say, in insurance, and you're setting rates based on climate conditioned financial risk models, which is a thing, and you're setting rates for Florida, those rates are going to affect, poor people who live in places where they can't afford anymore because the insurance rates are so high. They're going to affect companies and how much capital they have to hold back. So the numbers do matter in a lot of applications, and digging in through that is, it's something that has to be done because we're going to start having to ask, what's a world look like that's a 4.5 world, not an 8.5 world.
Do you think, Roger, we're going to see, you mentioned, I'll mess up your quote, but you commented the world is going to realize this, or this is going to get more coverage, or it's coming. Do you think there's a particular way in which that might happen? Is it going to be like when will this hit as the news story that we all think it should be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I could predict that sort of thing. I don't know that it's ever going to hit like all of a sudden, you wake up and it's a new day. What we're going to see is in the scientific community, studies are going to now be published that if they include the legacy extreme scenarios, they're going to get called out for it. And it's going to be less tenable to use those to promote this or that policy action or response. At the same time, there will be more and more studies that use the new scenarios. And inevitably, if you use a less extreme scenario, you're going to get less extreme results. And so there will be this sense out there that climate change has moved away maybe from the apocalyptic or catastrophic to the troublesome, problematic, and something we have to deal with. The analogy I often use is in the 1970s, there was a lot of concern about global overpopulation. Obviously, now we're worried about peak population and decline, but was there a moment when we said, oh, we've had our reckoning, and the population bomb is diffused, and we've moved on. So I do think it'll be fairly subtle, but I do think for people who have paid attention to and use climate model output, this is a big deal, and it's a story that they're going to have to grapple with in the coming years.
How do you think, I was thinking the last time you were on, the DOE had just done a report, and really a new assessment, if you will, as to the threats posed by climate change. In the intervening period, the endangerment finding has become, something that the administration is seemingly wants to do away with. You tell me, how does this affect that particular discussion and how it might show up in what the EPA is trying to do?
Yeah, so there's a couple things to say about that. So the DOE report was one that Chris Wright, Secretary of Energy, commissioned to try to focus attention on aspects of climate science that he and others believe were not getting enough attention. That report came under enormous attack and criticism from many people in climate science and in climate policy. One thing I'll note, that report included our work. Our work was some of the most cited in that report, and specifically our work on RCP 8.5. And in all of the criticism that came of that report, none of it focused on our work. And so in a sense, this really kind of vindicates Chris Wright's sense here. I mean, maybe the execution of that report wasn't the best, but there are aspects of climate science that have been denigrated and diminished and deserve more attention. And basically, I mean, you're not going to hear this message out too broadly, but the climate science community has reinforced the validity of an important part of that report that no one wanted to discuss. With respect to endangerment, if you look at the technical document on which the original endangerment finding was made, that's before the RCP scenarios. I mean, we're going way back. They use what were called the CCSP scenarios, the Climate Change Science Program scenarios developed under the Bush administration. They include scenarios even more extreme than RCP 8.5. So I know that DOE has very technical legal arguments about the endangerment finding and has set aside the science. But as we go forward, that technical document, which dates to 2008, 2009, needs to be updated with a look at how the climate world looks with these more moderated scenarios. Again, it's not going to make the problem go away, but it's certainly not going to be nearly as extreme as it was painted in that particular document. So whether the EPA endangerment finding survives or doesn't survive, we're in desperate need of an updated scientific assessment that's based on the science as of 2026, not the science of 2009 or 2005 or even earlier, because it's really important that we have the latest and greatest science out there, even if it's not particularly popular in some political circles.
Doesn't this say that we really need to fund more climate research? I mean, I know there's a concern that because of these stories, like if you publish this story and it gets widely discussed and, Chris writes special report, oh, this was going to put a chill on funding climate research. Actually, on the contrary, what it's saying is there's so much uncertainty, and this is so important, not apocalyptic, but it's, as you say, very important. It's a real risk to civilization, but we've got time to deal with it. And shouldn't we be funding? Shouldn't we make a huge effort to modernize both our tools that we use for modeling? They're available, as well as look at some of these other areas of uncertainty on the science that have been neglected over the years.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, not only should we have solid, secure, and even greater funding, we need more diverse perspectives. The idea that we're going to filter all of climate science through 4 scenarios, and that never made any sense. In my hometown of Boulder, the National Center for Atmospheric Research is on the chopping block, which I think is ridiculous across the atmospheric sciences. And another thing it says is that we need stronger institutions that sit between science and policy. There's a long story here, but the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which was created in 1991 congressional legislation, was put in the executive office of the White House. It's too tempting for presidential administrations, Republicans and Democrats, to put their thumb on the scale of that. And so we get assessments of climate science that are convenient to whoever's sitting in the White House, not accurate statements of where the science is. And so we need to treat climate science with the significance it deserves. And it's not just a political plaything.
I was going to say, Roger, it seems to me that you get 2 extremes, right? You got someone in one extreme is saying that there's no climate change, don't worry about it, everything's cool, right? A lot of people think they're kooks, right? Then you have other people on the other side saying in 10 years everything's going to end, the world's going to end, and they're kind of they're considered kooks. And it feels to me like what's happening now is we start to think about sort of more moderate, just maybe more balanced scenarios, that this is actually going to basically help the climate, help basically fund these things, because now you can have a coalition of people that are kind of thinking somewhat together as opposed to fighting each other, because everyone knows that extremes always get the best stories. Those are all the stories you want to put in print, but the ones that really count are the ones that really are on point, the ones that really are going to make a difference. Your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at where climate science is, and a lot of credit to the Working Group 1 of the IPCC, which is in my experience and in my areas of expertise has really called things pretty straight. Climate science is perfectly compatible with a pragmatic, realistic approach to energy policy. It's not, our hair's on fire and we got to get off of fossil fuels by 2030. And it's not, oh, it's a nothing burger, there's nothing to see here, as you say. There's a problem here. We should understand it. But the work of decarbonizing our economy is the work of the century. It's not going to happen overnight. And fortunately, climate science tells us this, it's not the apocalypse. It's a problem, but the world's not going to end in 2030 or 1.5 degrees or whatever. So I'm hopeful that this new baseline perspective on where the world's headed in terms of the energy and carbon dioxide emissions opens up some space for a more pragmatic and rational discussion of energy policy that, as we discussed, has to meet multiple conflicting objectives all at the exact same time.
I was thinking, Roger, you mentioned them, but there are a few places on the planet, more than a few, but a few stick out where they're really struggling with how to balance energy policy with their climate concerns. And Europe, Western Europe jumps out, California jumps out, Australia jumps out. Do you see, and we've been watching it, it's quite interesting. The California governor's election has a lot of conversation in it around energy policy, power prices, where they're getting their oil from, and everything they're spending on climate policy. And there seems to have been an acknowledgement over time that, California is not going to affect the world's climate, but, they try to, quote, lead. Any comments on those jurisdictions and how this change and how it's interpreted and reported could affect those places? Because they're quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that the discussions in all of these places is being led by economics and affordability. Australia, I think a lot of people in Australia were surprised to learn about their liquid fuel dependence. And we might see policies being put in place there to accelerate adoption of electric vehicles. They probably will pick that over building refineries. And so California is the same. I'm sure a lot of people were surprised to learn that California imports finished gasoline from Asia. And again, affordability is there. When the Chancellor of Germany says that the nuclear phase out was a mistake, for me, that was a big sign that, boy, we're in a new world all of a sudden. It just so happens that a lot of the resultant policy options that enter the discussion are consistent with accelerated decarbonization. If Australia switches to more electric vehicles, less liquid fuel dependence, that's going to accelerate decarbonization on that continent. So I do think this is one where hopefully coalitions can be built between those who are carbon first and people who are affordability first, because there's a big overlap there. And I do think the politics, if the governor of New York's talking about building a pipeline, it's a different world. Nuclear power is having a moment in many places around the world. So I do think that there is space that has opened up for these broader discussions where maybe the climate coalition and maybe people who are interested in energy for other reasons can find some common ground, and it's not just a purity test across the board.
Well, you've been awesome with your time. Last one as we wrap up, as you think about the rest of the year for the honest broker, what's on your radar? What now? Where are you going to be? Where are you traveling? We know you're in high demand, and you have many interests. So just give us a forecast.
One of the things I've come to learn with my Substack, and I'm incredibly lucky to have it and have such a great audience. Week to week, I honestly typically don't know what I'm going to be writing about. It is the world is moving so fast, and there's so many interesting topics. I mean, for example, I didn't know until 2 weeks before I wrote my post that RCP8.5 was dead. And so, that set my life on a different tangent. And that's what I've been talking about since then. And, with the war in Iran and, you look at your phone every couple hours and see what the latest tweets are. We are in an era of profound uncertainty. At the same time, I think we all know that energy access, energy costs is going to continue to be crucially important. And so, for me, it's being able to take the work that I and my colleagues have done over the last 20, 30 years and apply it to what's happening out in the real world today. And that's probably the best you could ask for as a policy scholar.
Well, awesome. Well, we're so pleased to be your friend. We appreciate you coming on. We appreciate you visiting with us at our events. We just love the spirit of what you're trying to do, which is just let's get the data. Let's try to understand as best we can, and let's understand there's going to be different views.
I appreciate it, man. It's great to visit with you guys.
Roger, you're awesome. Thank you, buddy. Thanks, everybody.